Tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening and welcome to Laidlaw College and to our first evening public workshop. We're delighted to have you here with us. And a special welcome to those of you joining us on the live stream on YouTube, and greetings to those of you watching this later on. My name is Liesl Baker, and I work as the Culture and Relationships Coordinator here at Laidlaw College. And yeah, as I said, it's a real pleasure to have you here in the person. Now, just a couple of important logistics for the evening. In case of an emergency, please make an orderly exit out the way you came, and the gathering point is at the far side of the parking lot. Hopefully that will not be the case, and you can just release this information from your minds immediately. Now is a great time to switch off your mobiles or anything that might ring or ding in the middle of the presentation. And wharepaku, our toilets, are located through the atrium at the back end, so you can make your way there if you need that. And a quick note regarding tonight's presentation. At several points during the evening, you'll be invited to respond and interact with your neighbor, or if you'd prefer, just quietly. You've got a handout for that. You'll be asked to reflect on a question and then feed some of these things back. And at the end of the evening, we'll have a brief time of question and answers. David will field some of your questions. For those of you who are joining us online, if you're with a group of people, you can reflect together. If you're on your own, again, you might want to reflect in writing. So grab a phone or a piece of paper to do that. But we also have this same PDF handout available for you, and you can find it by following the link, which is already in the live chat, and it's also in the description box just below your screen. If you, this is again to the people online, if you post your questions on the YouTube live chat, if you're watching live, we'll do our best to get to them in our question time. So we'd love to have you interacting with us this evening. Now, the reason you're here. I'd love to introduce our presenter. So David Crawley. Dr. David Crawley is senior lecturer here at Laidlaw College, and he specializes in the areas of Christian spirituality and pastoral care. And David has taught here for 30 years. Alongside his work at Laidlaw, David has trained in spiritual direction and in counseling, and also serves as an Anglican priest in Titirangi. Now, David's PhD research explored people's experiences of unhelpful forms of religious authority, with a view to better understanding why this comes up all too often in the church and in Christian communities. And so gratefully, we can turn to David and benefit from some of his work and research in this area. So I'm going to say a quick prayer and pass it over to Dr. David Crawley. So Heavenly Father, we are so grateful for our brother David, and we're grateful for his faithful stewardship in so many things, but especially in this particular area of work. Spirit, would you anoint him tonight to bring to life these words and concepts and practices in ways that will bless and minister to and perhaps even challenge us here this evening. Lord, would you help us to be open to receive and be able to respond to the thing that you might be wanting to do amongst us tonight. Thank you, Jesus, that you're with us. Amen. David. Let's welcome him.
So, yes, I can hear that. It's a bit ringy, but so. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko auraki, te maunga, ke waitaki, te awa, ko steamship, te waka. Hei Pākehā, toku iwi, ko David Crawley, toku ingoa. Ngā mihi nui, kia koutou katoa. Welcome. Thank you for your kind words. Liesl. So you have a handout there. It's not really an outline of what I'm going to say. It's just a few questions for you to keep thinking about. When it gets a bit boring, you can just have a read of that and have a think. And on the back is a list of some books that I found helpful around this sort of topic. Now, we're not going to follow, it's not an address, so don't settle into passive mode for the next 45 minutes and then Q&A, which has been the model we've sometimes had. I will talk more than enough, and probably about an hour's worth of talking nearly, but interspersed I want to ask you questions. The Q&A is going to go the other way this time, and I'll ask you some questions and hopefully have a little bit of quick feedback from you. So that's why we've sort of called it a workshop rather than an address or a lecture. And I also want to point out the title, Noticing and Naming Whose Power? Our Power. So I'm not going to be talking about the kind of big issues of power that tend to get the headlines. Sexual abuse in churches, presidents of the United States, which one has the legitimate place. And I'm not going into the big stuff. I'm more going to the micro, really, of what is going on between us and others that we mingle with in our relationships, our homes, our workplaces, our churches, and get us to sort of turn the spotlight back on ourselves. So my interest in power started, 30 years ago, when I just was beginning to teach here, and I completed a master's thesis on Jesus and power in the Gospel of Luke. And what that study really brought home to me is how radically different God's power, especially as revealed in the person of Jesus, is from our normal human constructs of power. And in the 30 years since that time, in other work that I do outside of lay law, spiritual direction work, I've heard stories from people that don't add up with what I found as I read in the New Testament about power. As Liesl mentioned, all too often there's a disconnect there between people's experience and what seems to be very clearly spelled out in the Gospels and in the New Testament, and in the Old Testament too, for that matter. So that motivated my interest in the topic and my PhD that Liesl mentioned. So we're going to follow this sort of outline. We're going to think about a scenario in a moment to get you thinking about power. We're going to look at a couple of definitions. We're going to think about the topography of power, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And then we'll offer some ways of thinking about our formation in relation to our handling of power. Some of the students here know that I teach formation, so you know it's going to end up in that place. And actually, when I taught ethics here so many years ago, what I found after teaching ethics for a few years is that I decided it is really about the formation of the person to be an ethical person. You can have a wonderful ethical system, but the people who populate that system are the key thing. So let's start with my hypothetical scenario, and I'm going to ask you to talk about it after I've done that. So Michelle is a 40-year-old manager in an NGO that is focused on addressing social needs in some of the poorer areas of the city. And one of the projects that she manages is staffed by 2 employees, Bill and Carrie, and there's some volunteers. So Bill's a 50-year-old who's worked for this NGO for more than 10 years. Carrie is just 30. She's only just started in the role, and she's just finished her Masters of Social Work. And 3 months into the job, Carrie comes to Michelle, the manager, to talk about her frustration with Bill. She's been offering several suggestions as to how they might be more effective in their project, but on every occasion she feels like Bill sidelines her ideas. She's got much more up-to-date knowledge of the field than Bill and best practice, and she feels that Bill doesn't respect that in her. When Michelle takes this up with Bill, he gets defensive. He says that Carrie's head's just full of ideas from her study. He may not have a formal qualification, but he has years of experience. He knows what works and what doesn't. And he feels that Carrie doesn't respect him and his experience. And he also asks Michelle, would she be giving so much credence to what Carrie is saying if she wasn't a female? So, either just think to yourself, if you're shy of talking to random strangers you happen to be sitting next to, or talk to the person next to you if that's okay, where do you see issues of power at work in this scenario? Just give you a couple of minutes. This is just to get your brain warmed up to the whole question of power. Where do you see issues of power here? Okay, enough. Enough just to get you thinking. So, quick fire feedback, just in a word or a phrase. What are the issues that are giving rise to power issues in this particular scenario? Gender, education, age, structures, experience. Okay, anything else?
Relationships or lack of.
Right, okay. And is there anything else you would like to know about the scenario to better understand where power issues might be? What haven't we talked about that could be relevant?
Pay, how much they pay.
Yep, money is a factor. Personality types and yep, temperaments.
I didn't understand. Is anybody reporting to carry a bill, or is they too alone? Is it just
They have volunteers. They have volunteers only.
volunteers?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ethnicity. Yes, we don't know about that, do we? But that could well be a factor. Role descriptions as well. Okay, so we're getting warmed up. But what is power? We haven't actually stopped to define it, and actually volumes are written on that particular question. So I'm just going to come down in a particular sort of simple place with this. So the Oxford English Dictionary says it's the capacity or the ability to direct or influence behaviour or events. And we might think of Mr. Strong as sort of the expression of power, but if power is that capacity or ability to direct or influence behaviour or events, that could be achieved in a number of ways. It could be, it could be through wisdom, or it could be through tenacity, it could be through being a squeaky wheel, lots of different ways. Second little definition there from Roger Priest, the ability to make things happen in human society or to resist and prevent change. So I included that because there's power that makes things happen, but there's also power in stopping things happen, and that idea of resistance. Now, a lot of people are wary of power because of what Lord Acton, put his finger on, that all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But Mary Kate Morse, who's written a book around leadership and power and influence, says power is actually God's gift. Powerlessness is not a virtue. Rather, using power to help the powerless is. That's the true meaning of servant leadership, and Jesus modelled this use of power over and over. And I emphasize that because it's actually quite naive and dangerous to think you have no power. Oh, I don't have any power, I'm just a cog in the wheel, I don't, and that can often disguise, sort of passive-aggressive forms of power that are actually going on. It's important to notice where power is, and that's what tonight's about. Okay, a little bit more work for you. To bring home the complexity of this topic, what forms of power are you aware of that might be operating in religious contexts? So if you think of a church, for example, or a religious organisation or community. So to get you on the wavelength of what sort of question I'm asking there, we would obviously have some power that's positional. So someone has a position in the community, they have a title. So that would be a source of, or a form of power. Or they may control the finances. They have another kind of power, another lever they can pull. It's the financial one. Talk to your neighbour, or talk within your own head to yourself. What forms of power do you think operate within religious communities that you've observed? Okay, 2 minutes. All right, folks, I'll interrupt you again. It's going to be one long series of interruptions this evening. So again, just like in a word or a phrase, if you can, quick fire, what other forms of power go on within a religious community?
Longevity?
Yes, yeah. Longevity earns a certain amount of power.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, good. Tradition.
When people hear from God really clearly and say, the Lord said.
Right, so sort of spiritual power, direct hotline to God, yeah. Some of you I recognise as students who were here a long time ago, and you will remember Bob Glenn, our church history lecturer. He called that the spiritual half Nelson. Half Nelson is a wrestling move that's very hard to get out of. Yep. Okay, what else?
I guess ministry power, so if you're the head of the worship ministry or head of
Okay.
the ministry or...
Yes, yeah, so that's sort of the positional one, but connected with a particular ministry, yeah.
Linked with emotional power.
Emotional power, right? You mean like sort of charisma or that sort of thing, yeah? Cultural power, yes.
Familiarity with scripture.
All right, yeah. Knowledge, yeah. Jenny?
Family. Been there for generations.
Family connections, yes. The power brokers behind the scenes, yeah. Yep. Anything else you're sitting with?
Gender.
Yes, gender. Psychological? Yes. Being curious to know what some of these might actually mean, but we don't have time to go too far.
Did someone mention sort of national structure?
Right, yeah. Overarching denominational structures, yeah. Yep.
Unhealthy deference.
Sorry, what was that, Jim?
Unhealthy deference.
Deference, yes. The power that's given. Yeah. Okay. Well, here are some things that I came up with, which includes a number of those, and maybe adds a few others to the mix as well. So ones we haven't maybe mentioned. So inclusion, exclusion. So the gatekeeping role. Who can belong, who gets chucked out or isn't allowed in. Sacramental power, who, like in an Anglican or a liturgical context, who handles the sacraments and, baptism and the Eucharist and that sort of thing. Representational power, who's in the place of God, who speaks for God. And we've talked about most of the others. Pastoral power, pastoral people deal with very vulnerable people. And there's an immediate sort of power difference that comes when people are vulnerable and opening up and sharing their deeper things. Decisional power, yeah, so those people or groups who have the power of decision within the community. I think, interpretive, so that's a little bit like who knows the Bible well, who gets to say what the Bible means, who defines the truth, that sort of stuff. Karen?
I was wondering also on the interpretive one, the person who mans the sound desk.
Right. That is the one of the two people in the church you don't want to upset. The other one is the organist. Okay, so just to bring home the complexity of power, a lot of these things would apply in other kinds of communities as well. But there's a particular one, and I think that's what you said, Liesl, earlier on. There's a particular one that's a feature of religious contexts, and it's the possibility of invoking God. So that is that sort of, if I may use the word, the trump card. In terms of power, that's, And when I did my PhD, that was a serious point that a number of people raised, that you were just too fearful to challenge the leader because they represented God. They were the anointed ones, and you don't touch the Lord's anointed. They have, and otherwise you're going against God. And one woman said to me, "You can't even think no, because God can see your thoughts." So that's the extent of control. So I want to offer you, a lot of tonight is me offering you ways of looking at things, just lenses or concepts that may or may not be helpful. So there's lots of ways of thinking about power. I guess often we tend to think power is something that some people have and some people don't have. It's a held, measurable thing. But what I want to sort of emphasize more is power as something systemic. It's a shifting thing. It's more like the weather than it is like having a certain amount of money in a bank account. And there are different questions. So on the left, questions about who holds that power, how much power do they have? Whereas on the right-hand side, it's more, what are the factors, the systemic factors that shape the flow of power? Is it good or bad that that person has the power? Rather, over here, it's like, well, what are the effects of the way power is flowing? And who is experiencing those effects? So it kind of, I find that helpful because it emphasizes that power is everywhere, just like the weather is everywhere. And rather than thinking, power is divided between the powerful and the powerless, power flows through and around our relational and connections and our interactions. So the word influence comes from the Latin into, and fluere, to flow, and then you get influentia, which is inflow, and then we get the English word influence. So in the word influence is that idea of flow embedded, and that idea that power is a fluid thing. It's not like a substantive concrete thing that one person has and one person doesn't have. It moves and shifts between us, depending on what's happening and depending on lots of things. So if we went back to our scenario with Michelle and Carrie and Bill, on the face of it, Michelle has the power, right? She's the manager. But if we thought about it systemically, as you highlighted, power's all over the place in that scenario. And it's flowing according to age, it's flowing according to gender, experience, education, possibly also the things we didn't mention, such as ethnicity and culture. So if Bill, for example, if we knew that Bill was from a particular culture where age and gender automatically positioned you, in a higher place in terms of hierarchy, then that's going to be a factor. So there's a myriad of ways in which we influence one another, and we're all always trying to do it, even if it's like, I want to watch this on Netflix, no, I want to watch that on Netflix. There's always these little power tussles that are going on between us, and we've got all kinds of subtle ways of exerting our influence. The lift of an eyebrow, a frown, a sigh, We've got a myriad of ways of exerting influence upon one another. And in our language, any reasonable person would think that, ... right? Yeah, so we're always positioning one another through our language as well. So this is what I mean about the micro versions of power that are always operating, that I'm interested in. So one of my metaphors for this, apart from the weather, is you remember this game with the box and the little handle on two sides, and you can tilt the board this way or that way, and you've got this little stainless steel ball that's making a tortuous journey around a track and trying not to fall into holes. So I kind of think that it's like we've all got our hands on the box, and we're all trying to tilt that thing, to get that little ball to flow towards us, and then someone else is tweaking it to flow that way and that way. So the landscape is always shifting and tilting. And sometimes it's very appropriate, if you're a leader, for example, that you tilt it so that the power comes to you. Okay? Can you very quickly think of any example where it would be appropriate to tilt it so that the power flowed around you in a certain situation? Yep. Yes, okay, so when the government says we're doing lockdown and we're doing it then and we're doing it this way, all right, they're aggregating power to themselves. Yeah, your example? Same one, okay. I said safety. Oh, safety, sorry, yes. So an example from one of our graduates, Jeff New, who was a minister out at Papakura for quite a number of years. And he's talked quite publicly about this, and I interviewed him about it for one of my classes. Towards the latter part of his time there, past his nightmare, he discovered that the daughter of a family had been sexually abused by an older member of the church congregation. So at that moment, it was very important that power flowed to him and to his leadership team to act very decisively on the discovery of that knowledge. And the Presbyterian Church hierarchy said to him, if and when the story's picked up by the media, they will have two questions. When did you know and what did you do? So it was really important that the thing was tilted, and the power flowed, and no apologies, we're doing it this way, right? But a lot of the time it's not like that, and it might be important that we tilt the other way and allow power to flow, to others. And I'm going to quote the illustrious Sarah Penwarden. Some of you are laughing because you know that Sarah Penwarden is not only a lecturer here in the counselling program, but she is my gorgeous wife as well. And in a chapter of a book she wrote about power as it operates in this place in the counselling training program. So any counselling training students here? Yeah, potentially, there's a few, yeah. So Sarah points out that because of counselling being a profession where safety is very important and competence is important, it is important that the counsellor educators act as gatekeepers of the profession. That's her phrase, gatekeepers of the profession. So there's times when they need to say, you can't do that, or you must do this, okay? On the other hand, there's a desire to let power flow that other way for the growth and the formation of the counselling students, inviting them to speak with their own thoughts as people with ethical intentions, and also as lecturers submitting their own teaching to an evaluative process. So in those sorts of ways they're letting power flow the other way. And so there's a bi-directional thing. And Sarah writes, I desire to model a relationship with counsellor educational power that opens space for dialogue and mutual learning, which models humility and openness. It's an ethic of humility that seeks to follow Christ. So I like that idea of that bi-directional flow of power and thinking about how we achieve that. So the first main idea I've wanted to sort of throw out tonight is the idea that power is something that is always flowing. It's everywhere, and learning how to notice that and recognize that. The second idea is that, like the weather, power is shaped by the topography of the system that we're in, social system, whether that's a friendship, a marriage, a workplace, a church, or whatever the system is. And what do I mean by topography? I mean the personal factors, the interpersonal factors, the organisational factors, and the social landscape that we're in. So let me just explain briefly what I mean by that. It's kind of what we were already talking about with the scenario. You picked up some of these factors. So it might be, for example, personal qualities, such as age. All right, some of the things we thought about with the scenario. Gender, ethnicity, educational status, emotional history, personal goals we bring to a situation, concern for reputation, whatever. Then there's the relational interplay that is going on. So with Bill and Carrie, for example, an age difference or an educational difference. So it's what's in there in the relationship between two people that affects the way that little stainless steel ball is flowing in terms of power. So imagine, for example, in terms of relational history, imagine if Carrie had grown up with an authoritarian father who took no interest in her studies. And how might that be affecting how she's responding to the way Bill's responding to her? Or imagine that at a previous job, Bill had had a complaint laid against him by a younger female employee, and how that might be affecting how he's looking at Carrie. So all of these kind of relational factors. Where the boundaries are and how well boundaries are being kept. Imagine if Michelle, the manager's husband, was in the same cycling group as Bill. New Zealand's a small place, right? So this kind of thing happens all the time. So, Bill and Michelle's husband have conversations. There's a line of influence, potentially, that's going on there, and there's a restraint, potentially, for Michelle of thinking, I've got to be a bit careful here. So there's that sort of stuff. Then there's the organisational. Things like what's the vision and values statement of this particular organisation? What's the model of management that operates? What are the work conditions? What's the pay like, as somebody said? What's the workplace culture? And then outside of that particular organisation or system is the wider social kind of stuff that's going on, and it will find its way into this situation. So the big issues like gender and culture, ethnicity, political affiliations, and those kinds of things. We'll come back to some of this stuff a little bit later on. But they've all got the capacity to tilt the board in different ways, and maybe even different to what we thought we were turning the handle this way, but in some mysterious way the board tilted that way. What's going on here? When I was doing my PhD interviews, I felt that 80% of the time everybody concerned on all sides of the issue had good intentions, and yet they ended up in some painful, distressing circumstances. Somehow power had ended up working in the situation in ways that hurt people, and that wasn't what people set out to have happen. Let me just give you another little scenario here. So here's an Anglican priest presiding at the Eucharist on Sunday morning. On the face of it, she's the one with the power, right? She's got the robes, she's got the vicar title, she's the only one who's allowed to do the sacramental stuff, she's the only ordained one. Seems like all power flows around her. But any pastors here? That's not the reality, Ian. There's all that other stuff that we put up on the board about religious communities and what goes on, that actually determines the flow of power in that situation. So for my PhD, I interviewed someone who, another Sarah, not this Sarah, about her experience as a new vicar in an Anglican church. And on a personal level, she brought her hopes to that church of what she could contribute and how she might help that church to grow in a sense of community and so forth. But she came up against a brick wall almost straight away. And there was very strong resistance to all her ideas. And in the end, there was outright hostility to her, and she ended up actually leaving the church. It was so unpleasant. And the factors that were going on in there, well, it's the topography. It's what she walked into that wasn't visible at first. For example, there was a very strong group of men in that church who knew each other from a particular, like a club or a social organisation outside of church. So they were all buddies, and they all decided they didn't like her, and they didn't like her ideas, and so she just came up against that resistance big time. And with that came a strong sense of entitlement. So all of these kinds of factors that we talked about on the personal level, the relational level, the organisational level, and the social or societal level, you could take examples of each of those in that particular situation. And in Sarah's story, two key words, I think. One is entitlement. And for various reasons, people feel that they are entitled to something, or they are entitled to have a voice, or they're entitled to have influence, or they're entitled to say what happens. I'm the biggest donor in the church, right? I give the most money, so therefore I get to say what happens about this and that. Or as somebody said, we're the original founding family, matey, we've seen lots of vicars come and go, and we will see you go. Don't worry about that, So all of that kind of stuff. So it's important to understand about the topography of power, because otherwise I think we end up with some puzzling and painful kind of situations arising. And Liesl mentioned the rationale for me doing my PhD was that puzzling disconnect between what happens in some churches and the example and the teaching of Jesus. I mean, seriously, it seems to me, and I'll probably tread on toes here, it seems to me sometimes the church makes a very big deal about things for which there are about 5 whole verses in the whole Bible. And how many verses are there about power and justice and how power is used, and yet churches feel absolutely free to ride roughshod over it? And that really puzzled me. And it kind of took me to that place of, you need to understand the topography. You need to understand all of these factors that are going on. Joseph Hellerman has written a book called Embracing Shared Ministry, and he's got a chapter called When Jesus Isn't Enough. And he says, why don't we use our authority like Jesus used his? Why instead do even the brightest among us so often leverage our positions of power to promote our own agendas, to the relational detriment of the very people we claim to serve? Now, he's got answers to his own question, obviously, and he particularly points, in terms of the topography, where he particularly goes is the third and fourth one, which was the way churches are organised and structured doesn't lend itself to Jesus-style power. And what's influencing that is often the wider social models and patterns that are feeding in. So his examples, church as business. And increasingly churches have to wrestle with business models. It's unavoidable. But when it becomes the primary sort of model, the CEO model of leadership, one man's vision as the goal, the telos of the church. And again, sort of, sorry if I tread on toes here, but one thing I came out of my PhD feeling very strongly about and very, very, very inclined to critique is what I would call the man of God theology. And by that, I mean, it's, we talk in a positive way about so-and-so's a real man of God or a real woman of God. That's not what I mean. I mean, at the top of the structure is the man, usually man, of God. He has the anointing. He has the authority. You don't question him. Your role is to, to submit and to support and to go with the vision that God has given him. You don't question. Question is spiritually suspect and dangerous to do. So I came out with a very negative view of that because I heard so many stories of the damage that happened. Emotionally immature and narcissistic leaders who cannot share power. I'm sure you cannot think of any contemporary examples there, but this was written about churches, not about other situations. And you get hints of that, actually. It's interesting in the New Testament. You get little hints of people like that who are floating around. In 3 John 9, John mentions the power-hungry Diotrephes, who loves to be first and will not welcome us. So, it's there right from the beginning. And compliant congregations, this is the sort of the match made in hell, between the narcissistic leader and the congregation that simply wants someone to tell them what to do and what to think and so forth. So he's giving those kinds of examples. And you might think of other unhelpful structures that don't make it easy to live a Jesus way in terms of power. Any examples quickly come to mind?
I once read that the third most popular job for a high-functioning psychopath was church leader.
Okay, so for the YouTube people, what was it? The third most popular job for a high-functioning psychopath was church leader. Right, okay. So that's not so much about how the church is structured, but it's an interesting point. Yep. Anything else about the way churches are structured that are sort of rubbing up against the call that Jesus gives us in the way we use power? Matthew?
Super churches that may be focused more on money than anything.
Okay, so the big mega churches and super churches.
I can't think of anyone.
Yeah. And we need to say, we're not necessarily saying all mega churches, but there is a possibility that, again, that plays into the hands of people, who are sort of, good example.
I just wonder when like-mindedness becomes surrounding oneself with yes people.
Right. So when like-mindedness becomes surrounding yourselves with yes people, and that is a model of leadership. It's it's out there in the business world as well, and so it transfers into the church. What you do first is you kind of clear out the old, dry wood, and you get your people who are with the vision, and away you go. And the thing is, that does achieve results. Power makes things happen. It's just, it may come at a cost. Yeah. Other things I was thinking of are, again, if we were in a very patriarchal context, then gendered structures are going to become part of the picture. Or if we're in a context where one ethnicity is dominant, then that will likely could well find its way into the church. So the church is run on a very monocultural sort of line, rather than an inclusive, bicultural, multicultural sort of way. Or a little bit like the example of the mega churches, but consumerist models, where understandably, for financial reasons, people want bums on seats, and that's how things are measured. And so we do things to maximize the number of people that we have, and sort of leadership becomes this slick dream team. And oddballs need not apply because you detract from our image, our brand, that kind of stuff. Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it becomes a bit slick, and so you look at Jesus' ragtag group of people that he surrounded himself with. It doesn't fit the model. Yeah. So coming back to that question that Halleman asks, I think I want to. So he's talking particularly about that third and fourth factor, the organisational and the sort of social. I want to go back to the personal and the interpersonal and say that's got to be a factor as well. And we have touched on that with the narcissistic leader or whatever that's in there. But I guess you can have the ideal structure, but it's populated by people, right? And so you also need to be doing something about that. And so this is where I eventually come to formation, you see, that if our aim is to have a kind of flow of power that is actually genuinely on behalf of people flourishing and good things happening, then we also need to think about the formation of the people through whom that power is flowing. And this is where I may lose you, but I'll give it a try. So I've been tinkering around with this little framework for a few years in thinking about this, which I've called Telos, Ethos, and Askesis, 3 Greek words. But if you don't like the Greek, go with the vision, values, and practices. And I think that if we want to move more to the sort of leadership and use of power that Jesus calls us to, then it's not just topography, but it's formation that's important. And these ideas of Telos, Ethos, and Askesis I've picked up from people like Michael White, who was one of the pioneers of narrative therapy. He in turn was drawing on the French post-structuralist Michel Foucault, who was a major theorist for my thesis. And he in turn was drawing on people like Aristotle and other Greek philosophy. And also we can throw in there James K.A. Smith more recently, and his work on practices and how they form us. So what do I mean by this? So telos means a goal, an end point. It's the vision that we have for all of this. So when we're thinking about power, what's it all on behalf of? Where do we want to be heading here? So telos is kind of the vision that we're holding for our lives, for our marriage, for our workplace, for our community, or whatever. So it'd be interesting to go back to our scenario and ask the people in that NGO, what's the telos of this whole thing? What are you about? What are you trying to achieve in the community? And then we can evaluate whether the way power is being curated is on the side of that telos or whether it's sabotaging that telos, right? Ethos is the values or ways of being which will serve that telos. So if that's our goal, how then do we live? Okay? And then how do we get to be people who live that way? And that's where askesis comes in. It's, you know, the word asceticism, you know, the ascetics were those crazy people who went and lived in the desert and lived, you know, did harsh things to themselves. It doesn't have to be like that, but it's practices that form us, is what we mean by that. Spiritual practices, relational practices, embodied practices, which help to form us in those ways of being. Brené Brown says, knowledge is only a rumour until it lives in the muscle. And so, you know, we can have our telos and our ethos all nailed, but we fall short because it hasn't actually translated into who we are as people. Does that make some sense? Yeah. So, just quickly, if we were thinking about telos, we could get a bit of a leg up by thinking about people who are thinking about ideas that people have already put forward around telos. So, for example, one word in Scripture, in the Old Testament particularly, that we might think about is shalom. We might use that word to say, well, wherever we're heading, God seems to be interested in shalom. Shalom literally translates to peace, but it's more than peace. It's a wholeness of life. It's relationships as they ought to be on all levels. It's flourishing within God's creation. So maybe we could put that as our telos. Or we might just use those ordinary words like flourishing and wholeness. We might think of John 10:10. I came that you might have life, and life in all its fullness. So we're on behalf of life and life flourishing. We might think in a more concerted way about social transformation or social justice. So Martin Luther King says, I have a dream. In other words, I have a telos. I've got a picture of where I want us to get to. And he spelled that out. That was his telos. So Laidlaw College has a telos, and we're encouraged to inscribe it on our hearts and put it under our pillow at night and so forth. A world shaped by love, compelled and informed by the gospel, and to equip students and scholars to renew their communities with a faith as intelligent as it is courageous. So it takes a bit of thinking about, it's a bit of a mouthful, but that's kind of like, why are we doing what we do here at Laidlaw? We're doing it towards that particular telos. And what might that look like in practice? Well, we have a thing called a graduate profile, where we've described the students as we hope they will be once they've been through our process here, our askesis, as it were. Some of them steadfastly refuse to be shaped by that process, but we had a student at graduation about 3 years ago. You know, we have 2 students who give reflections on their experience at Laidlaw, and one student was reflecting so proudly, none of my lecturers changed anything that I think. And he was so proud of it. Anyway, I wonder if you have a personal or a vocational or a relational telos that comes to mind. You don't need to talk about that just yet, but just have a little think. If you were put on the spot and said, okay, so what's your vision for your life or for your workplace or for your marriage or relationship? You know, what would you say? Or your church? Is there something that inspires you in that way? I'll give you just a little bit of time and I'll say one more thing and then I'll ask you to share with your neighbour if you do have something. But I want to make a little sidebar comment here. Sometimes conflict is an issue of telos or ethos. Those things may not be named, but they bump up against each other, kind of like the hidden part of an iceberg, you know, 2 icebergs sort of bumping into each other. So, for example, in my PhD interviews, one of the people I interviewed, Andy, was an associate pastor, and he had had difficulties with his senior pastor over the period of his time in a particular church. So Andy described his kind of telos and ethos to me. He said the whole aim of his ministry was that people would know that to be a human being is to be loved and held precious to God. That's all he wanted people to know and to experience. That was it. And so he saw leadership, his role, was attending to the larger presence of God who is shaping and moulding us together and journeying with us. So it was a very we travel together kind of sort of ethos that he had. Now, to be fair to the senior pastor, I only know Andy's version of the senior pastor, right? So bearing that in mind. But Andy's version was that the telos for the senior pastor was to build a large and successful church. Well, a successful church, which meant a large church. And influencing that was models of megachurches that he had seen on TV and other places. And the wider topography, that also was somewhat the telos of the denomination. That was the pressure that the denomination was somewhat putting on churches. You need to grow your numbers, you know. So that was there. And so leadership for him, it seemed, was exercising authority as God's CEO. And he valued people, or didn't value people, according to whether they were on board with his vision or not. If they supported his vision, well and good, they've got value. If they don't, well, they're drones and they might as well go to some other church. So you can see contrast of telos and ethos there, you know, and they just had a miserable time trying to work together. And Andy was very worn down and not in good shape by the time he finally felt he needed to leave that context. So, having had a little bit of time to think, have you thought of a telos that you might have for one area? If you have, I'm not going to ask you to report back, but just share it with your neighbour. What's a telos that inspires you, that you kind of see things heading towards in your life, your relationships, your work or whatever? Okay, just 1 minute to share that. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes, I'll mention that. Okay. Some of you may have a really specific kind of telos, that's a particular goal, and some might be broad, like, shalom's a very broad sort of telos. Or it might be a particular vision you have of, for your family and how you want your family to be, whatever. But the point is, if you're aware of it, then you can start thinking, so is the way that I'm actually handling things here supporting that, moving to that, or is it in some way subverting it, or what? Now, little commercial note. I will be making a PDF of the slides available on the website. We'll send out a link, so don't worry too much about trying to take photos or copies. You're welcome to, but I will put a complete set of the slides up for whoever wants them. Okay, so that's telos. What about ethos? So that's values and ways of being that embody, align with, support the vision that we have for our life. Ways of living. For example, if you have a telos of shalom and social justice, if that's what's really you're passionate about, then you would want to handle power in a way that aligned with that. Wouldn't make a lot of sense to be, the CEO of an organisation that was all about social justice, but the way you handled power was pretty oppressive and marginalised people and felt a bit sort of abusive. That doesn't align, right? So telos, ethos, is living in ways that actually align with that. We get a contrast we get a sort of illustration in the breach in the Old Testament in Ezekiel 34, talking about God's shepherds, so metaphor for the leaders of Israel. You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, you slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the sheep. So the sheep are the people, right? So you have not strengthened the weak, you have not healed the sick, you have not bound up the injured, you have not brought back the strayed, and you have not sought the lost. But with force and harshness you've ruled them. So we can tell what the ethos should have been from the negatives, but it was in the breach. Earlier on I talked about our Laidlaw Telos. These are aspects of the graduate profile, and they spell out some of the ethos. So I've sort of put in bold some of the words there, like love, authenticity, humility, respectful and authentic dialogue, faith, hope and love, confidence and intelligence, curiosity and respect. So this is what we hope, characterises our relationships, our ministries, our lectures and everything that we do. I think it's good, but I think to be really useful, ethos needs to get down to another level of specificity, because those are sort of fine-sounding words, but how do we know if we're actually achieving them? So something like a code of ethics starts to get a little more specific. So example here from Ara Taiohi, which is a particular NGO working with youth development in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so, I just picked out a couple of things from their code of ethics as examples. The youth work relationship is both a privilege relationship and a power relationship. This is what makes ethics central to youth work. A power relationship is legitimate where power is given voluntarily and without coercion. Abuse of this power happens when the youth worker uses the power given by a young person to further their own interest to the detriment of the interests of the young person. So there's a clear and most of us would be aware of that as a benchmark for our use of power. For me, it boils down to a great little question that I always give to students and others. Whose needs are being met here? In the way you're working, particularly if you're working with vulnerable people, or there's a power difference there, and the power sort of is more naturally flowing to you as the older person or the senior person or whatever, in the way you're doing things, whose needs are being met here? And this can be subtle, that I might be drawn into a particular ministry which looks like a ministry of helping the vulnerable, but actually I'm doing it so that I feel significant. Whose needs are actually being met here? Another example from that code of ethics, youth workers will create and maintain culturally and age-appropriate physical, emotional, sexual and spiritual boundaries. Youth workers have an ethical responsibility to hold each other accountable in this regard. So that might be a time when a leader thinks they see something happening, they think, I need to tilt the board to have a bit of power here and say, hang on a second, this is not good what's happening here. I need to make an intervention because there's a boundary breach going on here. So this is not an easy area to pin down, just like Telos isn't always easy. But is there one value or principle that you already are aware of operating that you have in the way you handle the flow of power? And remember, you might think, but I'm not a powerful person. Well, in relation to somebody, you probably are, right? If you think about it. And so I'll give you one example from my work, just to sort of give you a moment to think. So in my work as a spiritual director, for example, one very specific rule of thumb I have is the person who comes to see me is the one who sets the agenda for what we talk about. And why is that a principle? Why is that part of my ethos for spiritual direction work? Because the telos is that they are going to grow into maturity and confidence and dependence on God, not on me. So if I start setting the agenda, then the power is flowing back to me and they're sitting back and saying, okay, David, make something happen for me. All right? And when I'm training spiritual directors, I use the illustration of a medicine ball. You know those heavy balls we used to throw in the gym at school? And sometimes the person throws it to you and says, what do I do about this? So I throw it back and say, what do you think? All right? So Because if I give the answer, well, maybe it's helpful. And occasionally if they're totally stuck and distraught, I may, break my own rule. But generally I want them to be strengthening their muscles of listening to God and developing in themselves. So any little principle you've got, share that with your neighbour for a moment. All right, folks. Thank you. Are there two people who would be willing to share their example?
Basically, we said mutual respect, and I think that sort of summed up where we both were at.
Mutual respect. Okay? To engage with others with mutual respect. Thank you.
Self-control.
So, do you want to say a little more about that, Richard? Just
I'm trying to be self-controlled.
thank you.
It's one of those elements, like you're saying, in your own counselling process, where you have to prevent yourself from saying something.
Mm-hmm.
You have to toss the ball back.
Right.
If there isn't self-control there,
Yes.
it doesn't happen. And I think it's one of the great principles that I'm struggling for.
Yeah, we're not saying we're perfect in these, but yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Cool. Thank you. So, it's in every sphere of life. How do decisions get made in a marriage? And there'll be give and take, and if you've got two people, you can't have a majority vote, right? So hopefully you arrive at a sort of consensus between the two of you, and if you don't, what do you do then? Well, that's an interesting question. If it always ends up flowing one way, then is that a good thing? Or on some occasions do we say, well, look, my gift to you is I'll go with your way this time, and another time you go with my way, and it's that sort of collaborative thing that happens. Just like with Telos, it can be helpful to look at a few sort of big template kind of ideas around ethos. So on the title for tonight's talk is a classic one, isn't it? Micah 6:8. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. And the challenge of holding these three things together, just even holding the first two together is a challenge sometimes, to walk with both justice and compassion, care, is a challenge. So in informing our students, some of whom are here, around coursework, do we respond to a particular issue that they're having around completing an assignment on time, and say, well, look, the rule says, this is the right thing to do here, justice, or do we go with, look, I totally get the fact that this is going on in your life, and we can be flexible here, and we can give you more time, and so we're constantly sort of balancing these various things together. Interesting, I picked up from the Te Puna Hoora o Te Raki Paiwhenua website, it's a Māori health organisation, the holding together of tika, pono and aroha is another way of thinking. So these sort of things give us a framework, a good starting point good checkpoints to sort of run things past. So tika being justice and rightness, pono being acting with integrity and honesty, aroha, care and compassion. And to do each of those can be a real challenge for leaders. Sometimes we might think, well, we're doing the right thing and we're doing it in a compassionate way, but we're just going to put a little spin on it, how we talk to people about it. So we're not actually really quite, acting on the integrity side or the honesty side. We're slightly fudging the honesty so that we can act with compassion and not embarrass people or whatever. It's very hard to balance all of those. Another framework that I particularly like, coming out of my thesis, dialogic versus monologic ways of leading and relating. Now, I could do a whole talk just on that, but maybe it's easier to illustrate it than to explain it. So when I asked the people that I interviewed in my PhD research, who had had these not such good experiences with power, what hopes did you come into this community with? What were you hoping this community might be like? And these are some things that they said. Firstly, the one that came up over here, mutual respect. It's a pretty basic expectation. And care, valuing the dignity of each person, balancing that with responsibility for the overall good, acceptance of difference, environments of hospitality and participation, opportunity to ask questions and discuss issues without being cast as a troublemaker, knowledge of God being mediated by the body of Christ, not by one or by few, discerning with us rather than discerning for us. So, that's that sort of model where I listen to God for you and I tell you and you just accept it. Authority cannot reside in one person beyond question, the man of God theology. Submission to what is discerned by the community, not to one person as the embodiment of divine authority. So you can see some of these overlap. Authority used to enlarge life, not diminish life. So when I look at those, I would broadly say that describes a dialogic way of functioning. So in the word dialogue, you've got the idea of to and fro, two voices being heard, not one voice, not sort of silencing the other. Sadly, all these people had experiences where the flow of power had been consistently monologic. And the tricky thing is, something can look like a dialogue, but it's not actually dialogic. So very quickly, an example of that would be one of my participants who had some real concerns when a new leader came in and started to change things, particularly around how power was being exercised. And she very carefully and very respectfully put her thoughts in a letter, sent it to the pastor and to the elders. And the pastor said, okay, you can come and talk to us at an elders meeting about that. So she came, they all sat there stony-faced and looked at her. And then the pastor finally said, well, what have you got to say? And she said, well, I wrote you all a letter. I put it all down here. And he looked around and he said, got your letters, boys? And none of them said anything. She stumbled through a few things and went home feeling really distraught and not at all heard and not at all engaged with. So theoretically there'd been a conversation, except there hadn't been a conversation. It was like she might as well have been on mute and not made a blind bit of difference to anything. So that would be a monologic thing. Okay, so finally on this list here, coming back to sort of frameworks for ethos thinking, Amos 6:8 also had walk humbly with your God. And I think that's particularly important as well. And it starts to move us more into the Askesis part. So the Telos, the vision we're aiming towards, the ethos, our ways of living, the little guiding rules and principles that guide us into that. And then the Askesis, how are we being formed into the kind of people who do live that way? And so part of that, I think, in the Micah verse is the walk humbly with God. And just watching the time. But my key text here is Philippians chapter 2, which you know, Paul encouraging the Philippians to have this mind among you, which was in Christ. He, though was in the form of God, didn't count that as something to be held on to, but was willing to let that go and to take the place of the servant. But interestingly, Philippians is the only letter that Paul wrote where he specifically mentions leaders in the greeting. When he says to God's holy people at Philippi, together with the overseers and deacons. And Joseph Hellerman points out, Philippi is in a Roman context. And Roman culture is very conscious of status and honour. And so, the Colosseum, classically, all the levels of the Colosseum, so the senators get to sit right at the front, and then you go up and up and up, and then the highest point is where the slaves and the others sit. And in clothing and in status and in all kinds of ways, it's all marked out. So you've got the patricians, you've got the plebeians, and you've got the slaves in the lowest position there. And the kind of clothes you wear reflect that. It's really interesting. I've discovered reading Bill Bryson that right up until the last few centuries, there were laws in Britain around what kind of clothes each kind of class of person could wear. So clothing marked out your level in society. And so Hellerman's pointing out, Paul's writing to a church that's in this context. Remember the topography and how that finds its way into the church structures? Therefore, it's really interesting, I think, that when Paul addresses the church in that very first verse, he says, Paul and Timothy, servants, actually the literal translation is slaves of Christ. And Hellerman says he's writing to advocate a very subversive way of life, given the Roman context. And he sets the tone by saying, well, we ourselves are slaves of Christ. And then later on in Philippians 2, the one who didn't count equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself and took on the form of the slave, the doulos, the slave. And so Hellerman says, picking up this clothing kind of metaphor, it's like Paul is saying that although he was entitled to wear the clothes that marked him out as having the greatest honour and status, Jesus divested himself of that and instead took on the garb of the slave. And Paul is inviting the Philippian Christians to set their minds on that example, to meditate on that. And you can tell when you read Philippians that there's quite a bit of conflict in that church. Keeps coming back to it every now and again. And Paul's call is to an ethos of honouring one another and being of one mind and so forth. But how do they get there? What askesis will lead them there? Set your mind on Christ. Meditate on his example. And so that being, I think, a very helpful suggestion around how we begin to be formed as people of humility who walk that way of Christ. For sake of time, I'm not really going to go into this, but I found one person who actually used this word askesis, which I was really excited about, in relation to Philippians 2. And she's also saying that there's an askesis here for God's people. And it's one that we already see in other ways, in baptism and Eucharist, the idea of the dying in baptism, the dying to self and in the rising, and the Eucharist. Every time we take Eucharist, we remind ourselves of the Jesus who gave himself, the self-giving. And she says, perhaps particularly in prayer, particularly in silent prayer, where we just come and sit before God without a lot of words and requests, we are kind of opening ourselves and emptying ourselves and making ourselves available to God's transforming work in us. So that capacity for humble leadership and facilitating that dialogical flow of power, I think, presumes a deepening self-knowledge and humility and emotional and spiritual maturity to make it work. And that means a commitment on our part. There's no shortcut to that. Unfortunately, there's no little kind of button you can push to become that kind of person. It's through an askesis of various kinds. So I think part of it are those rhythms of meditation and prayer and worship as we continually recalibrate and redirect our focus to Christ and to his example. in times of self-reflection. I think also at the heart of askesis is that practice of genuinely dialogic encounter with the other. So keep practicing that, keep reflecting on whether your ways of relating and interacting are genuinely dialogic or are in fact subtly monologic. Is the power always flowing one way? The catch is, you're probably not aware of it. It becomes a pattern that even you are not aware of. And so I think part of the specific askesis we can do here is deliberately put ourselves in relational contexts that are a bit uncomfortable with people that are other to us, because that will help to sort of bring out things, bring to light things that are sort of lurking there. And develop a willingness to see yourself through the eyes of the other. Sometimes we're not very good at inviting or accepting feedback from one another, but constructive feedback is another way. So in practice, if you're in a particular helping profession or in a ministry or whatever, have a supervisor, have someone that you can go to and who will help you kind of reflect on these sorts of things and notice the blind spots. Or if you're a part of a home group where you've got that trust and that honesty, develop the capacity to give each other a bit of help and a bit of feedback. So those sorts of elements of askesis really address primarily the personal and the interpersonal aspects, not so much the organisational and the societal. So what I want to finish with is just some suggestions around what might help in that area. So I think having in place some corporate practices that help to develop these things. The ability to critically evaluate the flow of power within a social system. That's quite an art or quite a skill. So I'm talking in a corporate context, a team, a leadership team or whatever, a management team or whatever it is. Talk about these things, understand these things, and have times of critically evaluating how is power flowing in our situation here. And so Michelle, in our scenario, would need to give some thought. She might need to go and talk to her supervisor about this challenge with Carrie and Bill and how am I going to manage this flow of power? How am I going to understand what's going on here? Critical reflection on the social and cultural discourses that are influencing the flow of power. How is culture? How is gender? How are these other things feeding in to the situation? The ability and the courage to keep asking incisive questions of our own context and our own structures. Who defines the truth? Who gets to tell the narrative of how things are? That's a powerful position. Who spins the narrative? And is that narrative open to conversation? Or is that a monologic exercise? It's carefully protected. How are decisions made here? Whose voices are privileged and whose voices are not being heard or valued? Are our key processes dialogic processes or monologic processes? We might think they're dialogic, but are they really? Who benefits most from the current flow of power? How do I benefit from that? Whose interests are being marginalised? How hospitable to difference are our processes? And developing some resilience, because we're always going to bump up against heavy-handed people who aren't self-aware, and to survive in this sort of world and context and ministry, you do need to develop a certain amount of resilience and ability to handle those people, and that's another whole conversation. And there's 1 or 2 books on the reading list that might speak to that. Okay, so I do want to allow at least 5 minutes for Q&A. So let me finish with this, a little rewriting on my part of Philippians 2. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, so that even if your qualifications or your experience grant you mana, or your social context positions you with power, do not regard these as entitlements to be exploited, but instead focus on the priority of love. With the Spirit's help, encounter others as they are, not who you would prefer them to be. and risk vulnerability in offering yourselves to them as fellow humans, co-learners and companions in the journey toward life. Amen. So we have 10 minutes or so for any questions. Liesel's got a mic if you want to ask a question, and people on YouTube can send through a question and it can be read out. Okay, good. Wow, okay.
Where does anger fit, both good and bad anger, in the issues of power?
Well, there's power in anger, isn't there? And in my humble understanding, anger is a God-given gift that activates a system in a person that gives them a certain amount of energy and power to do something. Telos, ethos, all of that's going to be important, isn't it? Like your own example of self-control is going to be relevant to that. So how do I handle that anger constructively and handle it in a way that is actually going to serve a good telos, a good, and a good ethos. So, yeah, I think it's part of the picture. It's not always comfortable. Do you have any thoughts yourself, Richard, on that? In asking the question. Usually when people ask a question, they have a thought as well.
Years ago, I had blocked anger, both from a personality perspective and from a model perspective from my own dad in particular, and from an experience very early in life, 3-year-old. Once that was opened up, I experienced anger, which was, as Kath said, very significant in my viewing of what justice is. But without anger, I couldn't see what was just and right and proper. So I think, with all the good things you're saying here, anger is something that is essentially, let me be a man of God, it's God-given.
Yeah. So part of that askesis then is to be in touch with and to know how to respond to anger.
And that's why self-control has become a more viable thing in my life.
Yeah. I somewhat relate to that because I had a mum who had a pretty volatile temper, and I think as a little person I found that very scary, her anger, and so I tended also to hold that at arm's length. Yeah, but okay. Any other questions?
In any of the people that you interviewed, because it sounds like mostly they were talking about negative and destructive experiences, as the illustrations you used, were there any who found solutions other than leaving?
Probably not, and it's a self-selecting situation. Like if I'd randomly chosen people, I would have got a different picture of leadership, but I was focusing on that particular question, so that's why I had those people. It's interesting, I read some research that shows that when you have a situation with what we might call a toxic leader who holds on to power, generally they manage to outlast and outwit everybody who tries to challenge them, and it'll be the other people who end up moving on. They're very clever at being able to hold on to their position. And so maybe that was partly the situation. But to be fair, I don't think it was all about toxic leaders. I think it was, in some cases that topography. There was a very strong theology, for example. So if the leader earnestly believes he's the anointed man of God, and 80% of the people earnestly believe he's the anointed man of God, it's very difficult for one person to make much impact on that. And in the end, they decide, well, I've tried, I've raised my question, I've been told I'm, a Jezebel, I think I just need to move on. Good question, though.
I don't know the answer to this question I was going to ask.
If people wanted to like think about what's one step or one thing they could do to become more aware of power and how they were using power, what could they do? Just one thing.
I think they probably need to talk to someone who's got a bit of an understanding of these things, that can ask them the right questions. Because this is the whole thing about power, it's very often invisible. And even those topographical factors that are shaping it aren't obvious to us. And it's not until either you have an experience that wakes you up, or someone gets very angry or upset with you and they tell you what you're doing. It's very hard for you to see it in yourself. You don't see it looking in the mirror. But if you wanted to really explore that, then I think finding a person, a counsellor, a supervisor, a person who understands how power works, who can ask you some good questions, would be one thing you could do. Do you have any thoughts?
I like the idea of thinking about dialogue and thinking about the other person's otherness, that they can be different from me, just to keep on thinking that I don't have to try and colonise them with my own ideas. They can be separate from me and different, and that's okay, and that they're entitled to their opinion. So I think if I start to kind of try and stop that person having their own opinion, I think I'm trying to influence them too much. You know?
Yeah. As any of my students here will know, I have a little motto along with whose needs are being met here. One of my other mottos is, notice what you notice. And if you notice your inner reactions to things, so if you're engaged in conversation with someone where there is that difference and you notice something coming up in the way of feeling, then, opportunity to reflect. So, for example, I remember a couple of years ago when I was working on an article, having a conversation with a Māori person about their experience of a dream of someone who had passed away. And I said, I'd love to talk to you about that and to be able to write about that with your permission. And so we sat down and we had the conversation, telling the story. But he told the story starting like way back, way back here. And I'm looking at my watch and I'm thinking, when are we going to get to the dream? Come on, man. And so I noticed that coming up in myself. What's that about? My kind of utilitarian approach to time and wanting to get to the point and actually, forgetting this is conversation and kōrero and dialogue, and it's become, give me the information that I need for my paper, which is exploitative. Whose needs are being met here? And so the whole, challenge of decolonising research starts to come up at that point, and it's very challenging.
Great conversation, David. Thanks. This is really just a comment rather than a question.
Yep, sure.
But looking at the uniqueness of Christian power, which I think is its own unique set, and Christian power is involved with speaking on behalf of cosmic power. It's speaking on behalf of ultimate power. And so in that sense, it's different than political power, financial power, even social power. And I think that's where its danger lies, bluntly, is because it speaks on behalf of ultimate power. And
it challenges other claims of ultimate power too.
It does, and I guess I would just add into that, I think that something I've noticed in life looking at toxic power is it tends to partner with insecurity. I think insecure leaders, and we're seeing this right now, where a leader wants to protect, not show vulnerability, not show loss, not to lose face, to always, and that happens in church too, where a leader wants to be seen to know more, or has the assumption or the feeling that they have to know more than everybody else, rather than a leadership which is more facilitative and saying, I don't have everything at this table. What can I learn from you? And that's another model of power which I think as Christians we should be looking at.
Yeah, thank you for that. I tangentially connect off that to the idea of hospitality as a wonderful part of ethos that our heritage gives us, and how, you know, we think of hospitality as I have what you need, you come into my space and I give it to you, but actually, you know, hospitality it's actually it's a bidirectional thing, it's a dialogical thing, and you know, you come into my space and I am the one who ends up getting blessed by that and enriched and fed. Yeah. Mm. One more question, Jenny.
Yeah, a question from YouTube.
Okay, YouTube. Yep.
Should we seek power?
Well, I go back to that quote from Mary Kate Morse, who says, you know, powerlessness is not a virtue, and if we need empowering to something that we feel is right and just, and is on behalf of that sort of call from God to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly, then yes, we should seek the power we need for that. I believe. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much, folks. I think there's a cup of tea and a slice of something if you'd like to stay.
Thank you so much for that, David. I'll just close us in a little prayer. And we like to send people out with a blessing, so we'll also read a little blessing for you. So just a short prayer. Jesus, would you help us use our power the way that you used yours? Here we are with all of our fears and insecurities. And so we're all going to use our power in different ways based out of those things. Jesus, would you help us to see ourselves the way that you see us? Help us to see others the way that you see them. And help us to see you the way that you truly are. And give us absolute confidence in you, who was crucified, resurrected, ascended, and is reigning now. And so, friends, receive this blessing that Paul wrote to the Romans. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
It's great to have you with us. Go get a cup of tea. And let's thank David one more time.